Alrighty, time for a little bit of a different video today. Quick intro from me. Hey, I'm Bella and I normally make 3D VTubers with my 3D magic, but my ultimate goal is to one day make my own video games. Another thing about me is that I am indeed a horse girl at heart. I've been a little low-key obsessed with them ever since I was really young, sometimes very high-key obsessed. And I had a special interest in horse genetics as well, which, fun fact, when I got to the end of high school and we had like a careers day, I wanted to go into studying equine genetics, but I fainted when we started working with blood, so that was pretty much the end of that dream. About a year and a half ago, I had the realization of, well, what is really stopping me from making my own horse game? Worst thing I can do is just give it a go. I'm not much into the development or coding side of video games. My strong suit is making assets and animations, so every time I tried doing any coding in the past for other video game ideas that I had, it all went straight over my head and I just gave up eventually. This time I'll determine to sit through it, watch tutorials, and actually learn, so here's my journey so far as an absolute game making newbie. This may or may not turn into kind of regular devlog videos. This is just a project that I work on in my free time here and there. Sometimes I get a hyper fixation and binge working on it for a week straight, but we'll see. Progress in the beginning was very slow, of course. I didn't record any of the process since I'm mainly just fumbling around, watching through tutorials and such. I do, however, have screenshots from every day that I worked on this project, and I'm honestly very excited to show the very beginnings and you can see how it's progressed and improved over time. This old horse chibi model I scrapped from another project I just used to demonstrate a proof of concept, since I knew my downfall would be the coding side and I didn't want to put in the effort for nice new assets if I couldn't pull off the most important and challenging for me part. And so this is what it looks like in the very beginning, and you have to trust the process. I promise you will like the end result more. Another big thing that I know will be a challenge is the material. See, at this point I had the vision that a player can turn on and off different genes for the horse and essentially overlay different textures to make up the actual coat of the horse. I messed around with the shader graph for a while and I actually got to something that worked with the base bay texture with one white marking overlaid and then another white marking overlaid. And this is just day one of this project, and so it was a great positive and it actually made me realize that I could maybe do something with this silly little project. So I spent some time over the next few days getting really stuck into it and making sure all of the different genetic mechanics that are going to be possible before putting any serious effort into it. Basically, the base horse coat is a chestnut horse with an E allele, the horse is black, and with an E and an A, the horse is bay. They've got proper names, but I'm just simplifying it. The cream gene is a dilution gene, which takes a chestnut and dilutes it to palomino, a bay to a buckskin, and a black horse to a smoky black. And you'll start to see a pattern where each additional gene compounds and creates so many additional outcomes. Once I'm confident that I can pull all of these mechanics off, I start on a nice new model for this project. Again, no video footage, but here's some screenshots of the sculpting process. Basically, just start out with this very simple block model in the rough shape of a horse, matching the reference that I've got, and then I just have fun sculpting in all of the details, and I style some hair to go with it. After sculpting comes retopology. A sculptor mesh has lots of detail in it, so going over it and making it a lower poly will make it so much easier to work with, easier to texture, easier to run in the game, and overall it will just look a lot neater. At this point, I'm only on day 7 of this project, and I've got my fully retopologized horse, and I'm making the rig. The rig will go through many different tweaks and changes over the next few months, but for now it is a start. I also made a walk cycle, and I unwrapped the model in such a neat and organized way. I don't think I've ever laid out a UV like this before, but I wanted to make sure that it would, in the future, make my life a lot easier when it comes to all of the markings and the textures to come. Now, with the new base model done and the base texture for the chestnut bay and black coats done, I replaced the chibi horse model, and now we've got it looking something like this. It's really already such a drastic visual improvement. Speaking of drastic improvements, this is now how the shader is looking. An absolute mess, I know. But just you wait, it gets worse, I promise. The next step at this point is to go through and make all of the other base colors that I need. So chestnut, bay, and black, then the cream dilution for palomino, buckskin, and smoky black. But did I mention that if there's 2 cream dilution, the coat gets even lighter? So now we have cremello, perlino, and a smoky cream. There's also a champagne dilution gene, so a chestnut becomes a gold champagne, a bay becomes an amber champagne, and a black becomes a classic champagne. But then what if there's champagne and cream? Well, that gives us a gold cream, an amber cream, a classic cream, and you can also have 2 cream dilutions and a champagne, and that gives us a double cream champagne. And so I said, every new gene creates so many more options on top of the previous ones. But luckily, that is it for the base coats. All of the different factors like dun, sooty, roan, and all of the white markings and stuff, they'll just be an overlay over these set number of base coat colours. You might notice that now I've got some white markings in the mix. I start off just making some basic face markings and leg markings, since solid coloured horses can have these small white markings. Sabino markings are usually very irregular and can be patches of white or hairs just kind of mixed into parts of the coat. Tobiano is often very rounded markings, and the white will always cross over the spine. Overa markings, on the other hand, never cross a horse's spine and are often quite rough and jagged looking. Splash markings are often likened to the horse being dipped in white paint. The white will originate from the bottom of the horse and work its way up towards the spine. I will also take this time to mention that I have, in a lot of cases, simplified the workings of horse coat genetics into a way that is feasible for this game. There are so many factors that go into a horse's coat, and Sabino markings especially aren't very well known. So Clydesdale horses are very well known for having Sabino-like markings, though there has been no known gene that is the cause of this. Splash is another gene where there's often multiple different factors in play, and I've simplified it to just one predictable gene. Appaloosa is another complex gene. I simplified it to being one gene. The LP stands for leopard complex, and that controls the visibility of the Appaloosa patterning, while the pattern gene controls what type of Appaloosa, and they work in conjunction with one another. And the last one that I've been putting off talking about until last is the dominant white gene, represented as a W. There's been so many different identified genes on this locus. Some actually do turn the horse fully white, while others can have no or very little visible effects. Some are only seen in certain lineages of horses, some can be fatal. There's a lot to it. But I've kind of ruled the white gene to be a modifier. On its own, it doesn't do anything. However, if a horse exhibits any other white pattern like Tobiano, the amount of white on the horse will increase. Anyway, enough of the genetic explanations. For the functionality of how the markings actually work and overlay on the coat, I've separated the horse texture into different regions. The front left leg, the front right leg, the back left leg, the back right leg, the head and the body, though in terms of Tobiano there's also the front body and the rear body. And there's a bunch of different markings specific to each gene for each of these regions. At this point, I've run into a texture limit on the shader, and so I figure out that the best thing for me was to use texture arrays. An array can store all of these images for all of these different regions, and it will just call a specific image from that array as needed depending on what gene is influencing at the time. To make the markings in Blender, I have a plugin set up called Layer Painter. It lets me have the base coat of the horse set up, though I guess I don't really need to, but it's just nicer to look at and nicer to work on. And I can have a texture for the white marking on a new layer and paint only on that layer. I like drawing out my markings in Blender so that way I can see exactly how they fit and wrap around the horse, and then I'll edit it and clean it up a bit in Clipstudio Paint afterwards. When doing Appaloosa markings, there's some markings called Varnish Maroon that are very speckly and more scattered white hairs mixed into the coat than solid white markings. So I have a texture mask on my brush to paint in these frosty, flecky looking markings. The last main thing about the coat that I left until last was the graying mechanic. It gave me a lot of trouble, but I ended up having a bunch of different textures for the different stages of the graying process and just animating them in over time and then animating them back out. Mainly because grey horses aren't born grey, they're born like a solid colour like black, and then over time as they age they will gradually get more and more grey. I think there's enough talk about the markings though. It's a big part of this project because I went in knowing that one of the most important things for me for this game was having an insane amount of more realistic type customization so that 2 genetically identical horses could stand next to each other and you would still be able to tell them apart. That was a very important thing for me, and I think I've achieved that pretty well so far. For now though, I'm having some revelations about how the game will play. Rather than having the horse on a walk cycle in the code editor, I create a couple of different idle animations that will randomly play, and then I set up a new scene so that way after the player has customized their horse, they can actually run around in and control the horse. This is when I go back and edit the rig to work a bit better for what I need to, and there's a lot more control and flexibility with individual hoof, knee, and head and neck controllers. And now is the point where I sit and think, well, what's next? Everything that was kind of on my immediate to-do list is complete, and so I move into overhauling the UI in preparation for a tack editor. The idea that I had in my head was this vertical design carousel kind of situation that scrolls through the different categories. I didn't like it too much, so I abandoned it while I worked on the actual models for the tack set. Obligatory off-camera moment, I made the model of the bridle and an ear bonnet and started recording when tackling the saddle, which honestly I'm kind of glad that I did, because if it's only one thing that I documented on video, it's the saddle. Oh boy, was I nervous going into it. I'm a big fan of freehanding complex shapes like this, and I'm just mapping out the different sections of the different pieces as I go. I'm also thinking in layers from the base up. So the saddle has kind of this flat shape as the bottom layer, and then the knee pads can be extruded out later as kind of like a layer on top, and the saddle seat is worked up in different layers as well. I try and stay true to the different flaps and all the different pieces, that way my saddle has that extra added detail. I think it's quite hard to explain how my brain works, but it just does. This is of course an English set, mainly because that's what I'm most familiar with personally. It's meant to be more of an all-purpose basic set, but it's got all the bits and pieces. Similar to how the markings work, the tack options will be categorized into different regions, and only one tack piece can be on each region at a time. The head will allow for bridles and halters, the ears will be for ear bonnets, the chest for breastplates and such, of course a region for a saddle and one for a saddle pad, and lastly the legs for different kinds of boots and wraps. As a general rule, anything that is leather will come in 4 different colors. I've got a black, a dark brown, kind of like a medium brown, and a light tan. And for the English set, all of the fabric elements like the polo wraps, the saddle pad, and the ear bonnet will come in 12 different bright and neutral colors that you can mix and match with. And this is where I lost steam a little bit, and I didn't work on it much over the next 8 months. That was Fran shaking if you heard that. She's laying in my lap right now. But anyways, this is a passion project that I'm working on the side of everything else, and everything else just took up too much of my time. I could no longer justify putting so much time into it, and I had to focus on projects that would actually support me financially. But when I returned back to it, I got all of the tack implemented into the UI that I had made with all the color swatches, then decided that I definitely didn't like the UI. So back to the drawing board, I tried to come up with some more UI designs, taking some inspiration from other character customization games like The Sims and Final Fantasy. And here's how that looks. Now the framework for the tack UI is done and the mechanics are all sorted, it's time to populate it with some more tack options. This time I'm going for a Western set, again one that can act as more of a basic general purpose Western set and not for any specific discipline. The saddle blanket is up first, and I start out with just a basic grayscale texture to get the shading and details in. Later I can take it into Clip Studio Paint, do the cleaning up, and add a texture or a color over the grayscale. For this blanket, I went with a pattern design. It's the kind of pattern that I would see a lot when researching saddle blankets, though I do plan on adding in a simpler version in the same kind of solid colours as the English saddle pad. And then I would also need a nice patterned English pad to balance out the options a bit, and the to-do list is forever growing. But anyways, we're moving on to the main event with the Western saddle. This is quite literally just the same approach as the English saddle, just in a different shape. I focus on the bottommost layer that I can see that will form the main shape of the saddle, and I start cutting in edge loops and start defining for the layers on top. There's a lot of detail going into the saddle, and I'm honestly pretty proud of it. It's got plenty of buckles and loops and rings, and I still haven't gotten around to the bridle, rope halter, or breast collar as of this day, but I'll get to it. Just as quickly as I had recently gotten back into the project, Unity very shortly after proposed some controversial changes to their fees and licensing. I'm gonna be honest, this was about 6 months ago now, so I don't remember much of the details, but it was enough for me at the time to not feel comfortable continuing to develop this game on an engine where the future was so unstable. I've low-key been wanting to use Unreal Engine since the very beginning, as I prefer the visuals more than Unity, so I figured now was as good a time as any to make the switch. The problem is, I had never used Unreal Engine before. Part of why I decided to use Unity in the beginning was that I have used it before, especially when making VTuber models, and I've tried to learn bits in the past, and while none of it stuck, I like to think that it gave me a little bit of a tiny head start. After putting in so much work to get to this point, and after all that I had learned for Unity, it was a little bit demotivating to start all over again. So it wasn't until 6 months later that I would start the process of rebuilding in the new engine. And so that leads me to about a month ago in the present day. I at least knew the logic behind all of the mechanics after creating them in Unity, so it's just learning how things work in Unreal and creating it more visually with their blueprint system rather than in code. And this wasn't something that I recorded either, since it's mainly just a lot of fumbling around for me, but after about 2 weeks of hyperfixation, I was pretty much back up to the point where I was in Unity. And so after that point, I dialed it back a bit, worked a bit more casually, adding in some new cool things like implementing the Western tax set that I never did in Unity previously. I added in a layer of shine on the coat, which is something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. I've since turned it down a tiny bit, so if it looks real shiny and plasticky, don't worry. And there's placeholders all ready to go for everything in the UI. I've got a lot more variation in the coat colors. So a chestnut horse can pick from about 10 different shades and variations of chestnut, including a livid chestnut. Even black horses have about 10 different variations of black as well. And if you haven't picked up on the coat color there's in most of these progress pictures and demonstrations so far, my favourite horse coat is a silver dapple buckskin. There's also an extra idle animation that I did, so 4 in total now, and I love this one because he does a little head shake. He's so cute. And now we are up to the present day. This last week I decided that now that everything from Unity has been recreated and I've fixed up and added all the little things that I wanted to, my next step is working on some additional horse breeds. Before that happens, I would like a little bit more of a solid base to work from, so I've gone back to my model and created a nicely sculpted high poly version. I just wasn't quite happy with some anatomy things in the original, so I figured I would sculpt in the details from scratch. May have taken it a little bit too far at first, Blender crashed on me a lot, but we got there in the end. Basically, I can take this high poly mesh and bake it into a normal map texture that gives me this weird looking image. The horse that I'm using in the game has not changed, but I can add in this normal map to fake the extra sculpted detail from the high poly mesh. Pretty cool stuff, and I hope that you appreciate the editing that I did for you just right now. But now that some of the anatomy things have changed, I need to redo the base texture because it no longer matches up with the normal map and where all of the new muscles are. For this, I'm going back to the plain grey so it's easier for me to remake all of the colours from this neutral base. It's going to be a little bit of a pain, but the detail difference is crazy already. And if you're wondering why there's a bunch of blocky shapes poking out of the nose, that's because this little guy has whiskers now. He also has eyelashes. But it's just another little detail that I wanted to add in to soften the whole look, and it just makes it look a little bit more natural, I think, and 100 times cuter. And so this is kind of where we're at right now. I wanted to show off basically the road so far before I got too much further into it, but I hope that you enjoy what it's looking like right now. Though I'm seeing some things that I do need to fix up already because I made some changes to the horse base mesh after all and the tag clips through, but that's easy fix, don't worry, it will be fixed. If I do more update videos in the future, they will much likely be shorter than this one. Remember, I started this project like 18 months ago, and wow, saying 18 months as opposed to a year and a half sounds so much longer. But I just looked back at my time tracker as well, and I've put 200 hours into this project so far, 54 of which were just in this last month, which is absolutely crazy and insane. I'd also like to reiterate that this is a personal project for me. I would love to release this as a demo one day, and that is the goal as of now. I've got a whole document of all the stuff, but I have no guarantees of any of it. I feel like the coding behind everything is probably actually a real shit show if anyone was that knew what they were doing was to look at it, but it works and is mine and I'm having fun. I'm also always down to take suggestions. After I get the refinements of the base mesh all done, I'll be working on some more breeds. The first one probably being Clydesdale because they are one of my favourite breeds, so maybe tell me your favourite breed too and you might see them here. But that is all for me now, and thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.